There are over 2 billion Christians in the world today. And even though it is stagnating in the West, Christianity is still growing worldwide. It is hard to imagine how much impact some guys from Palestine could have on the world in such a short amount of time. Just 300 years after Jesus, it was the official religion of the Roman Empire. And today, our whole Western society are built upon Christian thought. So how did this happen? There is a book in the Bible that tells us the beginning of this story, and it is a pretty cool one. So let's talk about Acts. This is probably one of my favorite books in the Bible, probably because it is so simple. Not every part of this book is simple, however. The Holy Spirit does kill some people in this book, so that's something. But compared to the Gospels, this is so much easier to follow along, at least in my opinion. Maybe it's because it's in a chronological order, unlike the Gospels where the author just throws one story in after another. There is usually a reason behind the order, but it's a lot harder to find than just it's in this order because that's the order things happened in. But even though it's somewhat simple, it's still packed with so many cool stories about how God was moving in the first church. I'm really stoked about this book, so let's just get into it. If you haven't watched the video about Luke yet, I would recommend that you watch that one before this one, because Luke and Acts are written by the same author to the same person, and Acts picks up where Luke drops off. But just to give a short recap of the most important information, the books are written by a guy called Luke. Luke was a physician by trade and was probably a pretty educated guy. They are both written to Theophilus, but we don't really know who that is. He was probably a guy of high social status, and some people believe that he was either a lawyer or a judge, or something to do with the trial of Paul in Rome. If you've already read the book of Acts, you may have noticed how abrupt the ending is when Paul reaches Rome. The most logical explanation to this is that that's the point of history they're up to when Luke is writing this story. This will probably make more sense when I go through the texts. The Gospel of Luke moves from the areas outside of Jerusalem into Jerusalem, and Acts shows how the Gospel went from Jerusalem to the ends of the world, or just Rome. And the whole message of this book is perfectly summed up in Acts 1:8, where it says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth." It is how this message, by the power of the Holy Spirit, went from a pretty insignificant little group of people in Palestine to reaching the capital of the world, and by far the biggest city of the time, Rome. It is also a very important book to study because it acts as a backbone of the whole New Testament. The majority of this book will be about Paul's journeys around the Roman Empire, and many of the places he goes, he will send letters back to the places where he has been. These letters are the letters we today study as Romans or Galatians or Corinthians and so on. So it's helpful to see when Paul was in the city that he's writing to and what happened when he was there. So for instance, when we're studying the letters to the Corinthians, it's helpful to see what happened when Paul was in Corinth. But enough about that, let's get into the text. The structure of this book is very simple. It is split into two parts where chapter 1 through 12 is about the early church with Peter as their main guy. And then in chapter 13, we'll start following Paul around on his journeys, and from then on until the end of the book, the focus will only be on Paul. The next video I make will just be about Paul and his life and where he came from. So stay tuned for that next week. The first times I was reading this book, the hardest thing for me was just to have an overview of where were they going and who were they talking to, or what was going on. So to help you make sense of this, the next couple minutes I will just go through the whole book explaining what's going on and where are they going. So the book starts where Luke dropped off, with Jesus ascending into heaven and the disciples being left to wait in Jerusalem. While they're in Jerusalem, they pick a replacement disciple for Judas. They ended up choosing a guy called Matthias. We don't really hear anything about Matthias later in this book or ever. So some people think that Paul is the real replacement of Judas, which is an interesting theory, but I don't know. While the disciples were in Jerusalem, the Jews were celebrating Pentecost. which was the Jewish celebration of when they received the law of Moses in the desert. For this reason, there were a lot of Jews coming from everywhere in the Roman Empire to celebrate in Jerusalem. While the disciples were gathered together, the Holy Spirit fell upon them and they received power. They started speaking in languages that people coming from everywhere in the Roman Empire could understand. And Peter stood up and started preaching about Jesus, and 3,000 people started believing. Then we have a story about Peter and John healing a lame beggar. Then Peter starts preaching again to the people because they're in awe, but the Jewish council doesn't really like this and they get mad at them and they tell them to stop preaching about Jesus. But Peter said that we cannot but speak of the things that we have seen and heard. Then in chapter 5 we have an interesting story about Ananias and Sapphira, who sells a piece of property and gives the proceeds to the church. At least that's what they told the church, but in reality they held back money for themselves, and because they lied, the Holy Spirit struck them dead. That seems pretty harsh to me, but the Holy Spirit probably has his reasons. I'm not gonna try to explain this because I simply am not sure if I actually know if I can. Then the whole persecution of Christians ramps up when the Jews capture a guy called Stephen because he did some miracles. They accuse him of telling lies about Moses and the temple, and then Stephen has a defense speech where he goes through the whole history of Israel and leads up to Jesus being the Messiah, and the Jews resisting the Holy Spirit for not believing in him. They stone him for this, and Saul, better known as Paul, approved of this execution. The Christians were forced to move outside of Jerusalem, and we get some examples of how the disciples were doing miracle outside of Jerusalem, with the conversion of Simon the magician in Samaria and the baptism of an Ethiopian eunuch in Gaza. Then comes the story about the conversion of Saul. Saul was the guy that was approving for the execution of Stephen, and he was very much against the Christians. He even wanted to go to Damascus and imprison the Christians there. But on the way, he was met by Jesus. A great light appears that blinds Saul, and Jesus says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Saul starts to follow Jesus, and later in this book he will be called Paul. He didn't change his name. Saul is his Jewish name and Paul is his Greek name. Then a disciple called Ananias comes and tells him that he is supposed to share the gospel with the Gentiles. Saul starts preaching about Jesus, and the whole conversion story of Saul is one that has changed the whole world. From this point, it seems like the focus is on how the Gentiles are included and what that practically looks like. There is a centurion in the Italian cohort called Cornelius that has a vision that Simon Peter has something to tell him. Go and look for him. At the same time, Peter also has a vision. He's hungry and God shows him a bunch of food that he is not supposed to eat because it's unclean for a Jew to eat it. But then God says, kill and eat. Peter doesn't want to eat it, but God tells him that don't call what I have called clean unclean. This is not just about food, but it's also about the Gentiles. The people sent from Cornelius appears and tells Peter to come with them. And Peter goes into the house of a Gentile, which would be illegal for a Jew to do, and he tells him about Jesus. He explains what happened to the church, and they rejoice. Then we have a chapter about King Herod persecuting the church because that pleased the Jews, and then the Holy Spirit kills him. From chapter 13, we start mainly focusing on Paul. Paul and Barnabas are sent out from the church in Antioch to start preaching about Jesus in the synagogues. They start by going to Cyprus because that's where Barnabas is from and he probably knows some people. From there, they move on to another place called Antioch. There was a Greek emperor called Antiochus Epiphanes that named 5 cities Antioch, so that makes everything a bit more confusing. So this is not the same Antioch that they came from. The Antioch that they came from will be known as Syrian Antioch, and this is known as Antioch in Pisidia. Or Pisidia or something, I don't know. They preach about Jesus in the synagogue and some people believe them and some people don't, and then they move on. They go to Iconium where the same thing happens, and then they move on to Lystra. They preach the gospel in the synagogue again, but this time Jews came from Antioch and Iconium to persuade the Jews against Paul. And they drag Paul out of the city and they stone him. Stoning is a death penalty, so Paul should be dead. But he gets up again, so either he didn't die or he miraculously got healed and rose from the dead. And then he goes back into the city that just killed him and keeps preaching the gospel. Then they go back to the Antioch that they came from, And that's the end of Paul's first missionary journey. Then there is a big debate about circumcision. Some of the Jews believe that the Gentiles that started believing in Jesus should be circumcised and they should start following the Jewish laws and customs. Paul is strongly disagreeing with this. And they end up gathering all of the apostles and the elders in the church in Jerusalem, and they start discussing what to do with the Gentile converts. After a lot of debate, James gets up to speak. Out of Paul's letter to Galatians, we can imply that James probably was a guy that thought that Gentiles should be circumcised. But he probably changed his mind, and then they all agreed that Gentiles should not be circumcised. Then after this Jerusalem council, Paul and Barnabas agreed to go on a second missionary journey. But Barnabas wanted to bring John Mark, even though he had left them on the previous journey. Paul and Barnabas disagree so much that they split up, and we don't hear anything else about Barnabas for the rest of the book. So Barnabas goes to Cyprus, and Paul goes to the rest of the churches that they visited in the first journey. It seems like Paul doesn't really know what to do after he has visited all these churches. He tries to go several places, but he's denied by the Holy Spirit, whatever that looks like. But then in a dream, he sees that a Macedonian man is begging him to come to Macedonia, so he heads over that way. He comes to Philippi, where he meets a rich lady called Lydia, and she starts following Jesus. And he drives out a demon from a demon-possessed girl, apparently because she was getting really annoying. This demon was a fortune-telling demon, and some people are making money off of her, so they get really mad at Paul and Silas for driving the demon out, and they put them into prison. Then there is an earthquake in the prison, and the prison cells open up, but Paul and Silas doesn't leave. And if you've grown up in a Christian home, you've probably heard that story hundreds of times. After they are released from prison, they head up to Thessalonica, where after 3 weeks they are driven out by some angry Jews. They come to Berea, but when the angry Jews from Thessalonica hear that they have reached Berea, they come and just drive them out of that city as well. So Paul heads down to Athens alone, where he's supposed to just wait for his companions to catch up with him. But before you know it, he's in front of the Areopagus, which was the council in that city. So Paul is on trial again, and he has to explain what he is teaching in the synagogues. Some of them think that he is crazy, some think that this is interesting, I want to hear more from you. But Paul is like, I'm head out before I get into more trouble. Then he goes to Corinth and meets some Jews that has the same profession as him, which is tent making, and then he stays there for a while. He stays there for more than 1.5 years before he heads home to Antioch and stops by Ephesus on the way. Then we have a little paragraph about a guy called Apollos before the focus goes back to Paul. Paul starts his third missionary journey by going to Ephesus, and he stays there for a while until there is a riot because of him. A lot of people started to turn away from their old religion and started to follow Jesus. But this was a threat to the old religion's festivals, which created a lot of money for the city. But the leaders of the city got afraid because of the riot, because riots are a really dangerous thing if you're a leader in the city. So they quiet down the riot, and Paul moves on. He goes through Macedonia and Greece before he's planning to go back to Jerusalem. But he goes back through Macedonia and comes to Philippi. Here he has such a long sermon that a kid actually dies, and Paul has to bring him back to life. Then he goes to Miletus, where he meets the elders of the church in Ephesus, and he gives them some encouraging words before he moves on to Jerusalem. He gets a warning on the way that if he goes to Jerusalem, the Jews are gonna bind him, but it seems like he doesn't really care. So Paul comes to Jerusalem and visits James before he goes into the temple. Here some Jews recognizes him and want to kill him, but before they do so, he is captured by Roman soldiers. They don't really know who he is, but he wants to speak to the crowd. They let him do this, and he tells his story. Then the crowd gets even more mad at him, and the Roman soldiers wants to punish him. But because he is a Roman citizen, they cannot punish him before he has had a trial. Someone was trying to assassinate Paul before his trial in Jerusalem. And the Roman soldiers hear about this plot to kill him, so they move him by night to Caesarea so that they can have the trial there instead. Here he has his trial before Felix, the governor of that region, And Felix actually seems to believe in him, but he doesn't seem to want to release Paul before he bribes him. So Paul just stays in prison for 2 years. Then after 2 years, another guy called Festus takes over for Felix. But this Festus doesn't really know what happened and why Paul was in Caesarea and not in Jerusalem. So after the Jews ask him if the trial can be in Jerusalem instead, he's just like, sure. But when Paul hears about this, he appeals to Caesar so that his trial would be in Rome instead. This was one of the rights he had as a Roman citizen, so Festus couldn't deny him this. Then Festus hangs out with King Agrippa, and King Agrippa wants to hear about Paul. And Festus wants some more information about Paul before he sends him off to Rome. So there's another hearing about Paul. This one isn't really important at all, but it seems like Agrippa got pretty convinced. Then he sails to Rome, but on the way there is a storm and he is stranded at sea. After 14 days lost at sea, they see a beach. They head towards that beach, but on the way they strike a reef and they have to swim ashore. It turns out that they ended up in Malta, where they're greeted by the locals. Then Paul gets bitten by a snake, and the locals thinks that he is a murderer. But then he doesn't die, so the local thinks that he's a god. Then he heals the chief man of the island's father, and then he just heals everyone else on the island before they head off to Rome. In Rome, Paul gets to live in house arrest in his own house, and people gets to visit him. And that's where the story ends. We don't really know what happened in Rome, but at least he doesn't die for another 5 or 6 years, so he was probably released eventually. The book ends in a pretty abrupt way, so this is probably the setting that he is writing in. Paul was probably waiting for his trial, and Luke was probably writing this as a defense for him. Before we end, we have to talk about how this book applies to us today. I think it can show us how great of wonders that the Holy Spirit can do. If you can receive power from the Holy Spirit, there is no limit to what you can achieve. So stop doubting if God can do miracles today. God is as living today as when this book was written. But that's where I will end this video. I hope you enjoyed it and that it gave you a good overview of the Book of Acts. Please comment down below if you have any feedback or if you have any thoughts on the video. And if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, and also don't forget to subscribe. It actually helps out a lot if you actually subscribe. You can also support me financially on Patreon. The link to that is in the description down below. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.